Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Capital Crimes. I'm your host, Ariella Thornhill, and this is episode 1, The Ford Pinto Disaster. But it might be more appropriate to call this the Ford Pinto Death Trap, as we'll see later on. Ford was a titan in the automotive world. They revolutionized American industry with the introduction of the moving assembly line, forever altering the landscape of production. But in this episode of Capital Crimes, we're delving into the dark side of the profit motive. Imagine a company so fixated on the bottom line that it sold explosive vehicles, coldly calculating how many lives would be lost in horrific fiery crashes. Yet the true horror lurking behind this story is even more chilling. Welcome to Capital Crimes, the Ford Pinto disaster.
Meet the Pinto. Just born. Ford's Pinto is priced like a small economy import, but it's frisky, with a wider stance than any little import, so you won't be pushed around by the wind. And Pinto's strong, built to run and run and run. Pinto, a little better idea at your Ford dealer.
Our story begins in the small town of Osceola, Indiana, a community of just over 2,000 residents. On a warm August day, 3 teenage girls set out for a carefree outing, unaware that a grave tragedy would soon strike them and their families, unaware that Ford had predicted their deaths years before. But before we get to that, let's look at Ford's relentless push to get the Pinto onto the market. In the 1970s, Ford sought to capture a growing market segment dominated by foreign imports. The Ford Pinto was marketed as an affordable, compact car designed to compete directly with smaller, more fuel-efficient vehicles from Japan and Europe. Positioned as the American answer to these popular imports, the Ford promised both economy and style at a time when fuel prices were soaring and consumers were increasingly looking for value. The decade was marked by skyrocketing fuel prices, a direct consequence of the 1973 oil embargo imposed by the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, in retaliation for U.S. support of Israel during the Yom Kippur War. This embargo led to severe fuel shortages and long lines at gas stations, fundamentally changing the landscape of American energy consumption. Concurrently, the U.S. economy was grappling with high inflation, which eroded the purchasing power of everyday Americans and made budgeting for essentials like gasoline a pressing concern. As a result, consumers turned away from traditional gas-guzzling American cars and looked towards more fuel-efficient vehicles, often imported from Japan and Europe. This shift in consumer demand set the stage for domestic automakers like Ford to introduce models such as the Pinto, marketed as affordable and efficient American-made alternatives to foreign imports. Ford's marketing strategy emphasized the Pinto's low price, fuel efficiency, and modern design. Advertisements showcased the car as a smart choice for budget-conscious consumers, young drivers, and families looking for a second car. The Pinto was different from its foreign competitors, not only in the aggressive pricing, but also in its quick development timeline. Determined to respond to the urgent market demand, Iacocca championed the creation of a new car, the Ford Pinto. He set an aggressive 25-month timeline from the conception to production of this vehicle, a stark contrast to the usual 43 months. Speed was of the essence, and every moment counted if Ford was to capture the market share before foreign competitors solidified their foothold. To keep the Ford Pinto affordable, Iacocca pushed for a tight budget, aiming to sell the cars for under $2,000 and cars that weighed no more than 2,000 pounds. This meant that safety features were sacrificed for cost and weight constraints. This focus on cost control would ultimately lead to the decision to release unsafe cars to unknowing consumers. Within the walls of Ford, this breakneck pace meant that concerns about safety fell on deaf ears. It was out of the question to redesign the Pinto. The assembly line was already in place. Crash tests on the Pinto revealed a fatal flaw. The positioning of the fuel tank made it dangerously prone to rupturing and igniting in rear-end collisions. Each test that resulted in a fiery explosion only deepened the engineers' anxieties. Later, Ford employees would say their grave concerns were dismissed as part of a general culture in the company. No questions, no changes, no looking back. Engineers and safety executives found themselves increasingly troubled by the results. Several drafted detailed reports outlining the risks and proposing crucial safety modifications. One engineer anonymously told Mother Jones that, quote, "There are few of us here at Ford who are concerned about fire safety. They are mostly engineers who have to study a lot of accident reports and look at pictures of burned people. But we don't talk about it much. It isn't a popular subject. I've never seen safety on the agenda of a product meeting, and, except for a brief period in 1956, I can't remember seeing the word safety in an advertisement. I really don't think the company wants American consumers to think too much about safety for fear they might demand it, I suppose." Reports circulated throughout the company's channels, reaching the desks of senior executives. However, each time the response was the same: silence or outright dismissal. The cost of redesigning the fuel system was deemed too high, especially given the razor-thin profit margins the Pinto was supposed to maintain. An internal cost-benefit analysis, chilling in its cold logic, emerged. Known later as the Grush-Sonby Report, it calculated the cost of potential lawsuits from burn deaths and injuries versus the cost of fixing the fuel tank. The analysis concluded that it was cheaper to settle claims than to make the necessary safety improvements, estimated at a mere $11 per car. It was released internally at Ford in 1973. Despite the clear warnings and mounting evidence of the Pinto's dangers, management pressed forward. Lee Iacocca, driven by the urgency to capture the market and beat foreign competitors, prioritized speed and cost over safety. Publicly, the Pinto was touted as a marvel of economic engineering, a symbol of American resilience in the face of an economic crisis. Ford released the vehicles on the basis of the Grush-Sonby Report's cost-benefit analysis.
Here we are at the Demolition Derby, folks, where the old model cars will knock each other around. Hey, Sacco, how come you're using your new Ford Pinto?
Observe. Pinto's the only American car with rack and pinion steering, like Jaguar and Ferrari, for really precise turning. Pinto's the only American car that comes with a standard 4-speed transmission for snappier action. And Pinto's got rugged, oversized brakes. Pinto turns in a smaller circle than the leading import.
Anything else?
Yeah. Easy repairs. Inexpensive parts. Well, you can change bumpers or fenders quicker than those other cars can. Pinto's hard to hit, easy to fix.
The winner, Pinto. It's hard to hit, easy to fix. A little better idea from Ford.
As the Pinto hit the market, stories of horrific accidents began to surface. Vehicles erupted into flames from minor rear-end collisions, leading to tragic deaths and severe injuries. The engineers' worst fears were realized. The once hidden memos and safety reports gained new life, this time as evidence in courtrooms and media exposés. Ford's predictions came true. Minor crashes led to catastrophic suffering. But Ford continued to skirt accountability until 3 girls set out on a carefree car trip in Osceola, Indiana. On August 10, 1978, Judy Ann Ulrich, aged 18, her sister Lynn Marie, 16, and their cousin Donna, aged 18, set out on a carefree car trip to a basketball game. The 2 sisters and their cousin pulled to the side of the road and were struck by a vehicle. Within seconds, the car burst into flames. Lynn Marie and Donna were killed instantly. Judy Ann was taken to the hospital where she died some 8 hours later. Osceola, Indiana was a small, close-knit town nestled in the northern part of the state, with a population of just over 2,000 residents. The town's landscape was dotted with neatly kept lawns, local businesses, and the occasional farm, reflecting the town's way of life. Osceola's economy largely revolved around local industries and agriculture, with many residents commuting to nearby cities like South Bend for work. The town's residents were primarily blue-collar workers, farmers, and small business owners who valued hard work and community ties. Schools, churches, and local events played central roles in bringing the community together, fostering a spirit of mutual support and neighborly care. The 1970s brought both change and continuity to Osceola. Like much of the country, the town felt the impact of broader economic challenges, including the oil crisis and rising inflation. These issues influenced everyday life, with residents becoming more mindful of their spending and the efficiency of their vehicles. The allure of fuel-efficient cars grew stronger, reflecting the national trend towards practicality and cost-saving measures.
The American automobile, for so long the symbol of America's wealth and extravagance, is dying. New cars and used cars stand like shining tombstones in the showrooms and parking lots of the nation's car dealers, unloved, unwanted, and unsold. People can no longer afford to run cars that do 12 miles to the gallon. Petrol stations can no longer afford to fill up cars whose tanks take 20 gallons. The monsters are dying of thirst. The energy crisis is killing them.
Death can become an emblem. Osceola, the namesake of the town, was a soldier, leader, and fierce advocate for Native Americans. After a hard life as a fighter, he died painfully, slowly suffocating from an abscess of the throat caused by chronic malaria and tonsillitis. His last wish to the attending doctor, Friedrich Whedon, was that his body be returned to his native Florida for burial, a final resting place and a final peace. However, after his death, Whedon decapitated Osceola, buried his body, and placed his head on display in his drugstore, the human into the commodity, the denial of wholeness, and the ultimate expression of control, even in death. Whedon even placed the head of Osceola in the bedroom of his 3 sons as a form of punishment. He later gifted Osceola's head to his son-in-law, another physician, who gave it to Valentine Mott in 1843. Mott placed it in his surgical and pathological museum, where in 1866 it was destroyed in a fire. The girl's death in Osceola would become an emblem as well. This time not of colonial domination, but of the cold indifference to human life that underlies the profit motive. Selling this death trap made financial sense for Ford. The benefits outweighed the costs. In their quest to take over the American auto market, these girls were just collateral damage. Here are the words of Frank Camp from the book Whistleblower, read by co-author Myron Glazier.
We were having problems with a car, and I can remember I went into my manager's office. And he said to me, "Look, we're in the business of selling cars, and every time we barrier crash a car and it causes problems, then we have one failure. If we get another car to crash to see how the first failure happened, we may have 2 failures. This could compound itself until my bonus would be reduced." Now, this was the kind of thinking, the corporate attitude that my immediate superior had. He didn't say anything about crashing for occupant safety. He just didn't want his bonus to be cut down. It bothered me if even only one person should die or be disfigured because of something that I was responsible for.
Camp's experience is emblematic as well of the routine harassment whistleblowers face. Despite the best of motives, they are silenced over and over again. But he wasn't alone in his outrage. In 1978, the state of Indiana brought a case against Ford and its executives for the murder of Judy Ann, Lynn Marie, and Donna. It would become the first criminal case against a company in American history.
Cosentino prepared to enter the 84-year-old courthouse. The theme of this case was clear, that Ford management deliberately chose profit over human life. In court, he told the jury 2 former Ford employees and company documents will show that management knew the Pinto fuel system was unsafe. He said Ford sacrificed human life for profit. Cosentino added Ford's failure to act resulted in the deaths of 3 women on an Elkhart County road. Cosentino said Ford management was told a $6 per car improvement might prevent the fuel from leaking in a rear-end collision, but management decided it was too costly. Ford attorney James Neal came back fighting. He said what the state had presented was simply not true. In his opening arguments, he said his best defense is that the designers of the Pinto bought the car for their own use. He said they are not reckless killers. Neal added their own tests show other compact cars would have met with the same results when rammed from the rear.
It is.
After the court session, Cosentino indicated he was impressed.
Well, I suppose I should not have been surprised, but I was at the awesomeness of their case. Evidently, they have crash tested many vehicles, not only the Pinto, but other vehicles. A number of experts will testify, a number of people that are employed by Ford who evidently drive a 1973 Pinto. Certainly, I was impressed with what we're going to get here.
So now the testimony begins, as much as 6 to 8 weeks worth before the jury can make their decision if Ford is guilty of reckless homicide. For the news, Rick Sullinger, Channel 6 in Winamac, Indiana.
The crux of the case was this. Ford executives knowingly sold cars that were prone to explosions, even with minor rear-end impact. Prosecutor Michael Constantino decided to pursue criminal charges against Ford, specifically charging the company with reckless homicide. Here are some key points of the prosecution's case. Knowledge of the defect. The prosecution argued that Ford was aware of the Pinto's design flaws, which made the fuel tank susceptible to rupturing and igniting in rear-end collisions. Internal documents, including crash test results and cost-benefit analyses, were presented as evidence that Ford knew about the risks but chose not to address them adequately. The cost-benefit analysis. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was Ford's internal cost-benefit analysis, which calculated that it was cheaper to pay off potential lawsuits from burn deaths and injuries than to fix the fuel tank design. This analysis coldly assigned a monetary value to human lives and concluded that the cost of making the Pinto safer, just $11 per car, was not justified by the potential monetary benefits. Negligence in design and manufacturing. The prosecution argued that Ford's decision to prioritize production speed and cost savings over safety resulted in a reckless disregard for human life. They highlighted the safer design alternatives that were available, such as the use of a rubber bladder in the fuel tank, but not implemented due to cost considerations. And, finally, the prosecution used expert testimonies. Various experts testified about the Pinto's design flaws and the feasibility of safer alternatives. These testimonies aimed to demonstrate that Ford's actions went beyond mere negligence and entered into the realm of recklessness, given the known dangers and easily available solutions. The defense argued they had complied with regulations. Ford's defense argued that the Pinto met all existing federal safety standards at the time of its manufacture. They contended that the car was not inherently defective by the legal standards of the era, and that the company had not violated any laws. Industry norms. The defense also argued that Ford's practices were consistent with industry norms and that other manufacturers had similar cost-benefit analysis and design considerations. They also claimed the accident was unforeseeable. The defense tried to frame the accident as an unforeseeable event, suggesting that the specific circumstances leading to the fire were not something Ford could have reasonably anticipated. And this is despite the fact that internal documents showed them testing exactly such a scenario and it resulting in cars that became death traps. The outcome and the impact were felt across the nation. However, the prosecution was not successful. Despite the compelling evidence presented by the prosecution, the jury acquitted Ford of all criminal charges in 1980. The verdict was influenced by arguments that Ford had complied with existing safety regulations, and proving corporate criminal liability had proved challenging. But the case and its legacy live on. Although it resulted in an acquittal, it had far-reaching implications. It brought significant public attention to the issue of corporate responsibility and product safety. The trial underscored the need for stricter safety standards and better regulatory oversight, leading to reforms in automotive safety and regulations. It also set a precedent for holding corporations accountable for the safety of their products, influencing future legal and regulatory actions. But there's more to this story than meets the eye. Ford may have suffered a disastrous blow to their reputation, but not enough to change their practice of selling and marketing unsafe cars. Could the Pinto and other vehicles have taken other lives well into the 90s? We'll investigate after the break.
910. That's the number of quality inspections that are made during the assembly of Ford's new Pinto. Now here's another number for you. 1919. Ford suggested retail price. Freight charges $99. Dealer preparation charges, if any, state and local taxes not included. When we say Pinto is quality built and import priced, we're not horsing around. You don't get to be first any other way.
In my opinion, Indiana lost the case because Ford's lawyers were fighting this long before the trial in 1978. As early as the 1950s, Ford tried to shift the blame for auto accidents onto the drivers, not the manufacturers. As the US government sought to create more safety regulations, Ford did everything it could to delay and derail these measures. I'll read from Mother Jones' famous 1977 article, Pinto Madness. When a federal regulatory agency like the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration decides to issue a new standard, the law usually requires it to invite all interested parties to respond before the standard is enforced, a reasonable enough custom on the surface. However, the auto industry has taken advantage of this process and has used it to delay life-saving emission and safety standards for years. In the case of the standard that would have corrected the fragile Pinto fuel tank, the delay was for an incredible 8 years. Standard 301 was targeted for delay, and with some assistance from its industry associates, Ford succeeded beyond its wildest expectations. The standard was not adopted until the 1977 model year. Here is how it happened. There are several main techniques in the art of combating a government safety standard. A. Make your arguments in succession, so the feds can be working on disproving only one at a time. B. Claim that the real problem is not X, but Y. We already saw this in one instance. The problem is cars, not cars, but people. C. No matter how ridiculous each argument is, accompany it with thousands of pages of highly technical assertions. It will take the government months or preferably years to test. Ford's large and active Washington office brought these techniques to new heights and became the envy of the lobbyist trade. The Ford people started arguing against Standard 301 way back in 1968 with a strong attack of Technique B. Fire, they said, was not the real problem. Sure, cars catch fire and people burn occasionally, but statistically auto fires are such a minor problem that NHTSA should really concern itself with other matters. Strange as it may seem, the Department of Transportation, NHTSA's parent agency, didn't know whether this was true or not, so it contracted with several independent research groups to study auto fires. The studies took months, which is just what Ford wanted. Ford continued to push for delays in critical regulations that would have tanked the release of the Pinto, and it worked. So a piddly case in rural Indiana? Well, that should be easy. But despite the loss, this was an important step in making companies accountable for selling deadly products. It became the first criminal case against a corporation in America, which is no small thing. But did Ford learn its lesson? As we'll see, the deaths continued past the 1970s and well into the 90s. The IIR, or Institute for Injury Reduction, had Ford in its crosshairs for a while. As more Ford vehicles caused death and severe burns for passengers, IIR issued a letter in 1989 urging both Ford and then the National Highway Traffic Safety Association to recall the cars. There were issues beyond the Pinto, Any vehicle with a similar fuel tank design could easily rupture in a crash and catch fire. Ford, as we have seen, knew this as early as 1968 and continued to sell these cars well into the late 1980s. Deaths continued into the 90s, with one of the more horrific cases happening in Rhinebeck, New York, when the DeMeo family was struck at a low speed. I'll read from the Hudson Valley News article from April 2nd, 1992. Quote, "It was a minor personal injury accident and it turned into a real tragedy," said State Police Captain Arthur Hawker. Investigators have contacted the Federal National Transportation Safety Board to find out information about the 1981 Ford Fairmont car Bonnie DeMeo, 33, of Clinton Corners, was driving when the car burst into flame. Doug Nelson, vehicle safety researcher for the Center of Auto Safety, a public interest organization, said certain Fords built between 1978 and 1985 were made with a fill-up neck gas part that leads to the gas tank. What could happen in a crash is that the impact could jar the fill-up neck and fuel falls out of the gas tank, Nelson said. He said the 1981 Ford Fairmont has a fill-up neck. On Monday at 8:15 p.m., April Palmbeck, 17 of Rhinebeck, smashed her 1985 Subaru into the rear of DeMeo's car on Route 9. DeMeo's car caught fire, and 4 of her children were unable to escape the blaze. Justin, age 3, Brian, age 7, Rebecca, age 9, and Jennifer, age 10, were pronounced dead at the scene. Bonnie DeMeo and 2 other daughters in the car did not receive life-threatening injuries. Michael Paris, a public affairs spokesman for Ford, said that the 1981 Ford Fairmont model has no prior history of fill-up neck problems, and accidents occur. Quote, "The vehicle model has no pertinent recall," he said. He said organizations such as the Center for Auto Safety usually take the opposite side of auto manufacturers. Cindy Razlis, program director of the Institute for Injury Reduction, a nonprofit organization in Maryland, said the 1981 Ford Fairmont was on a list of vehicles whose fuel tank systems were unsafe. Quote, "It's been devastating," Razlis said about the number of fatal accidents in the United States because of the gas system. Ford has told us there was no problem. The DeMeos, the Ulrichs, and countless others perished at the hands of Ford. Mother Jones estimated that nearly 500 people died from the Pinto alone, but we may never know how many died from Ford Mercury's, Lincoln's, Mark IV and Mark V vehicles, Thunderbirds, Cougars, Bobcats, Mustangs, Capris, Fairmonts, Zephyrs, and Granadas, all models which use the same faulty fuel system that made even minor accidents potentially deadly. But cars aren't the whole story. On May 14th, in 1988, a Ford school bus was hit by a drunk driver on the way to a church event. Autopsies revealed that it was the fire, not the crash, that caused the deaths of 27 people and severely injured 37 more. During a criminal trial against the drunk driver, Eugene Sober, a safety engineer with NASA, said many of the 24 children and 3 adults killed could have survived the crash if the seats were fire resistant. Defense attorney William Summer asked Sober, quote, "On the day this bus was manufactured, the day it rolled off the line, do you have an opinion as to how dangerous the interior of this brand new bus was?" To which Sober replied, quote, "My opinion is the fire hazards, of the material used for the seats was well known in the early 1970s," and continued, "I did know the materials were very toxic and would burn very rapidly and very easily and very intensely. Flexible polyurethane, which the seats were made of, is the single largest class of fuels involved with fatal fires. Foam treated with fire retardants was, quote, readily available to the automotive industry when the Ford school bus was manufactured in 1977. Former Ford Motor Company Vice President Thomas Feeney testified that existing technology could have prevented the fire, but was barred from giving more details. Feeney also said a fire beneath the bus boiled gasoline into the bus, quote, like a tea kettle, and squirted flaming gasoline into the bus, quote, like a flamethrower. Ford knew of the dangers its vehicles posed for decades. Ford, instead of acting, blamed the victims, blamed consumers for safety issues, campaigned relentlessly to stop regulations, refused to recall vehicles, and continued to flout safety measures that could have saved lives. Ford settled a civil lawsuit for $5 million with the families affected by the bus crash after a 6-week trial in 1992. During the trial, the parents of 10-year-old victim Patty Nunnally had offered to accept a single dollar from Ford if it would recall its older school buses and put protective cages around their exposed gas tanks. Ford rejected the proposal. The death toll grows. In 1991, the Institute for Injury Reduction again issued a call to recall the estimated 4 million cars with the older, flawed fuel designs. Quote, death and injuries are still occurring from this design, said then president of the IIR. The incalculable tragedy continues. We have a continuing repetition of needless, horrible burn, death, and injury that is disgusting. At the time, fitting those 4 million vehicles with improved fuel systems would have cost about $200 million, or $50 a car, a small amount compared to Ford's more than $6 billion in cash and marketable securities at the time. But Ford's knowledge of these safety issues becomes even more egregious when you learn that Ford had the ability to implement a number of cheap fixes that would have created safer cars. That's right. Ford owned the patent on a much safer gas tank as early as the 1970s and could have used these and other options, but instead opted for the old design because the Pinto assembly line was already tooled. Remember that 25-month timeline? As Mother Jones reported in 1977, internal company documents in our possession show that Ford has crash tested the Pinto at a top-secret site more than 40 times, and that every test made over 25 miles per hour without special structural alteration of the car has resulted in a ruptured fuel tank. Despite this, Ford officials denied under oath having crash tested the Pinto. 11 of these tests, averaging at 31 miles per hour impact speed, came before Pinto started rolling out of factories. Only 3 cars passed the test with unbroken fuel tanks. In one of them, an inexpensive, lightweight plastic baffle was placed between the front of the gas tank and the differential housing so that these 4 bolts would not perforate the tank. In another successful test, a piece of steel was placed between the tank and the bumper. In the third test, the gas tank was lined with a rubber bladder. But none of these protective alterations was used in the mass-produced Pinto. Ford had multiple low-cost solutions to the fuel tank issue, but the death toll mounted and dangerous cars stayed on the road, and the money rolled in. Death, as we've seen, can become an emblem. In this case, not enough did. Commodity and profit were placed over human life. The assembly line rolled on, churning out car after car with a fatal flaw known to those in power. The Ford Pinto, thanks to the case brought by the state of Indiana, became notorious as one of the only times criminal charges were brought against a company for the death of their consumers. In the criminal world, we talk a lot about recidivism, but in corporate crime, even with a company's mounting death toll, it's never mentioned. The story of the Ford Pinto disaster is about more than one of tragic oversight or corporate negligence. It's about the biopolitical double standard for corporations. While this case was well before Citizens United, which famously declared corporations, quote, people deserving of political free speech, one has to wonder, if corporations are people, would we allow an individual to kill hundreds, many of them kids? Would we accept it as just the cost of doing business? America is not alone with this corporate liability shield, but it is behind the times. We'll explore how other countries hold executives criminally liable, but that's another episode. Until then, this is Capital Crimes, reminding you to mourn the dead and fight like hell for the living.